Okay, so those of you who are online to get lunch, just proceed, but proceed quietly. So I'd like to welcome you all to today's Talsky Center event on race and justice in America today. In international human rights law, racism is absolutely forbidden. We all have a human right under international law to be free of racism. And the United States has even ratified some of the treaties that contain the prohibition. Yet the list of injustices perpetrated against African Americans is an extremely long one, going far back in this nation's history and persisting today. Just think of the unending succession of injustices in the 21st century alone. Police shootings of unarmed Black men, enactment of onerous state voter ID laws, and repeal of key parts of the Voting Rights Act, continued de facto racial segregation of Black and white school children. These are just a few examples. And speaking of continued school racial segregation, I think one of the tragedies of this era is the evident exacerbation of racial tensions, fanned by President Trump's racist invective and policies against minority groups. It is a strategy as old as the hills, road-tested and insidious: divide and conquer. And this is divide and conquer according to race. The Trump administration is very good at it. I invited Professor Jelani Cobb here today to speak to these matters and to help enlighten us as to the way out of this oppression. Before I let him get a word in edgewise, let me give you a few highlights from his bio. He is the Ira A. Lipman Professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Before that, he was Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut, where he also directed the Africana Studies Institute. He is a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker, where he has published many articles, including The Anger in Ferguson and Murders in Charleston. He is also the author of several books, such as Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, and one that has piqued my interest very much, although I haven't read it yet, To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip-hop aesthetic. Finally, he is the recipient of multiple prestigious awards for his journalism and other writing. So it is my great honor to present Professor Cobb.
Good morning. So it's kind of stingy with the greetings. Say good morning.
Good morning.
All right. How are you all? Good. That's good to know. I want to, one, say thank you for the invitation. I've never had the opportunity to visit this campus before, but it also is good that I got to come here not only to talk with you all, but I got to see a very old friend of mine, Professor Gilmore, who we knew each other way back when we were in our 20s, which was, 5 or 6 years ago now? And it's kind of long stories we could tell you about when we were roaming around DC and in the same writing circles and trying to figure out how to get some modicum of decency and fairness and increase the quotient of justice in the world, even if only by a small amount. And so I'm happy to be able to talk with you this morning And I'll give you a couple of kind of ground rules so you know where I'm coming from. One is that I have an interesting kind of niche. Most of what I do these days is journalism, although I have a PhD in American history. And it dates back to my time as an undergraduate student at Howard University. I was an English major and a history major, kind of double majored. And around senior year, people were asking, are you going to do the English thing and pursue journalism, or are you going to pursue the history thing? And my answer was always yes. And so I'm someone who works in both of those arenas. And for a long time, I was told that that's not, I had to choose one or the other. And what I came to learn eventually was that it was important for my understanding of the world to be able to do both of those things at the same time, because the historical sensibility contextualizes the journalistic work that I do. And the journalistic work that I do very often points to the ultimate implications of the history that I'm interested in. And so I'm always looking forward and looking backward and trying to make the connections between the two, which is a little bit of what I'll be doing in this conversation today. And just as a kind of grounding, when I was invited here, I was asked to bring my comments to address Dr. King's point, his statement that we were all bound in an inescapable network of mutuality. He goes on to say that we are in fashioned into a single garment of destiny. This is in the opening portion of his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. And he's saying this. The reason that phrase ever flowed from his pen, and as a quick show of hands, how many of us have read the letter from the Birmingham jail? Okay, good. How many of us know what it was originally written on? Excuse me? Did someone whisper it? That Dr. King wrote the first draft of this on scraps of paper, including toilet paper, that he could get access to in his jail cell. And it was then, piece by piece, smuggled out to SCLC workers who would then type it up. And this went on for several days until he had completed the entire draft of it. I always like to point that out when people are complaining about having to write papers. It's like, you have the benefit of the internet, computers, Microsoft Word, Scrivener, all these things will basically write the paper for you. No one is saying that you really want to show how dedicated you are to this. You'll get that roll of Charmin, break out your pen, and then start quoting Thoreau, like get your deepest analysis of Thoreau, and then we'll see where you get with that. But he did this. And the reason that phrase ever flowed off the tip of his pen was that he was responding to very specific allegations that had been directed at him. And this was in 1963. His critics in Birmingham, and really the critics of the movement in general, but particularly in Birmingham at this point, were accusing him of being a, quote, outside agitator. And this is language we've heard before and heard recently, much more recently than when Dr. King was writing. And I'll come back to some of the significance of that, but he's accused of being an outsider, which was something that was very common during the civil rights movement. The people who were advocates for equality, people advocating for justice and freedom, fairness, they would be disparaged as being outsiders, very often with the kind of implication or connotation that they were communistic outsiders, or that people who were outsiders didn't belong in these communities where they were. And what King says is that there is an inescapable network of mutuality. It's in that same paragraph where he says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Moreover, as a Christian, he goes through the prophets of old and cites them as as evidence for his Christian responsibility to come to the aid of those who are being deprived of justice no matter where they are. And he makes this theological argument for this. For those of you thinking about this in legal terms, he may have just been establishing his standing. And so Dr. King is talking about the right that he has to be in Birmingham. Never mind the fact that he is a Southerner, born and raised in Atlanta. Never mind the fact that he had pastored a church in Alabama, in the very state that we were talking about. Never mind the fact that he was, as what would have been called then, a Negro. And as such, he would have been, the laws that he was protesting were directly applicable to him. So he was not an outsider in any of these contexts, but people were trying to conjure the most narrow understanding of who they are, a kind of very small, municipal, local version of who they are, to say that Dr. King does not belong there. And in this letter, he goes on, as you well know, if you've read it, to say not only is this his responsibility, but that his fellow clergy, particularly white moderate clergy, have been abandoned their responsibility in this regard, and that the biggest stumbling block to racial progress is not the Ku Kluxer, as he says, the Ku Klux Klan member, or the White Citizens Council member, but it is the white moderate who is much more inclined to respect what he calls a negative version of peace, a negative peace, which is kind of a stalemate in which there's an absence of justice, as opposed to tolerating the presence of the creative tension necessary to bring about positive social change. This is where Dr. King is coming from in this letter. All these things are applicable, and all the implications of what Dr. King was talking about have applicability to our current situation, our current circumstances. Not to go too far afield, but very recently I had the opportunity to interview Colin Kaepernick, and we were talking about the kneeling protest that he began in response to the incidents of police brutality, the loss of lives, unarmed people losing their lives at the hands of police. And he continued to express dismay over the fact that people were much more worried about him kneeling during the national anthem than they were about people losing their lives at the hands of the state. And Dr. King says exactly that same thing. That comes directly from the letter from Birmingham jail. He says that in their letter of criticism of him, to his dismay, they were much more concerned about the nonviolent protests that he had initiated than the presence of segregation and injustice, which had in fact spawned these nonviolent protests. And so there's this inescapable web of mutuality that Dr. King talks about. It is not a unique concept, doesn't originate simply with him, but he's talking about a kind of humanistic obligation, is deeply rooted in the foundational thinking of the founders of this country. And when they say we the people, presupposing that there is a group of people who can be referred to in the first person plural, we, and that as a element, as a group, as an entity, they have particular rights and responsibilities and so on. Everything that we consider a possibility of democracy is rooted in this perception. We also see in their writing and thinking the elements of race and racism and distinction that were the basis for King protesting in the 1960s and for all the protests that had led up to that. And so I just want to talk a little bit today about how we have moved astray from that idea of we the people, or the idea that Dr. King talked about as the inescapable web of mutuality, and what the implications are, how we've gotten to the particular moment we're in right now. In 2015, I went to South Carolina in June 2015. And it was in the immediate aftermath of the shootings at the Emmanuel AME Church. It's an individual, 21-year-old by the name of Dylan Roof, who shot 9 African-American members of the congregation of a historic black church. When pressed in the midst of this shooting spree, a person whom he had shot, a young man by the name of Tywanza Sanders, whom he had shot but who had not yet succumbed to his injuries, posed the completely reasonable and obvious question of why. Why are you doing this? He says, I'm doing this because your people, because you all are raping our women and your people are taking over the world. This is what he says. That happened on June 17th, 2015. On June 16th, 2015, I always have to say this, I always make sure that like if I'm ever quoted on this, I'm not proposing a causal relationship between these two things, but rather that these two incidents are responding to a common zeitgeist. But on June 17th, Dylann Roof authors this atrocity and gives this as a rationalization for it. 24 hours earlier or thereabout, a gentleman took a ride down a gilded escalator in Trump Tower and announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. And in the course of making this statement, in the course of launching this campaign, he articulated his rationales, being among his many other reasons, the fact that there were Mexican rapists afoot in the country. And so we had this kind of common response to this very kind of antique dynamic in American history. If we know anything about American history, we know that there is never a moment in which the idea of there being dark-skinned men who are a sexual menace to white women, presumably Trump is referring to, in which it does not open the door or at least become a rationale for atrocities, or for extra-legal behavior, or for the licensing of mob actions and so forth. And so these two things happen in close proximity to each other. And they're connected to this bigger question, this bigger theme, this bigger narrative in American history. If we look back, 2015 was the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. As a kind of element of just a kind of general rule, if you are going around someplace and two sides fight a war, you can always tell which side won, because the side that won is the one that gets the monuments. Right, yeah. And so in Charleston, there's this very particular history around this, that not only does this shooting happen in the near stone's throw from Fort Sumter, where the war began, but also not very far from these massive Charleston monuments to the Confederate cause, and to this almost kind of Confederate theme park, a relationship that Charleston has to its history. And so 2017, I go back to Charleston for the trial. It's the beginning of the trial. And when I go, actually toward the end of the trial, I noticed that a building that I've been walking past every day is actually the Confederate Museum. And so I stop in, go up. Brian. He knows where this is going. So I go upstairs, and this museum is there, and there were two women there, two white women, could not have been more polite. One was in her 40s, and one was maybe in her late 60s, and it was very welcoming. They were showing me all the artifacts of the Confederacy in Charleston that they had there, and they noticed I'd forgotten to take off my press badge. And so the younger woman wanted to know why I was there, and I said, "Oh, I'm here to cover the trial." And she said, "The trial?" I said, "Dylann Roof." And she said, "Oh, we don't need a trial for him." And I said, "Why not?" She said, "We don't need a trial. We should just get rid of him." And I said, "Well, it's interesting that you'd say that, because the jury is right now deliberating whether or not to give him the death penalty. And she said, there's no need to deliberate, just get rid of him. And I said, that's interesting, okay. And so then I just raised what was to me the obvious question and said, well, what do you make of the idea that Dylann Roof did what he did as a justification, as a kind of homage to the cause that is being memorialized in this museum? Right, the question went over exactly as you would expect it did. And so it's a kind of awkward silence, it settles in, and she says, oh no, that's not true. The Confederacy did not have anything to do with hate. But we're gonna get to this, I mean, I don't wanna seem like because this is fairly easy. I'm in Michigan and I'm talking about South Carolina, but we're going to get to this, this broader context of this. She says the Confederacy had nothing to do with hate. He didn't understand what the Confederacy was about. And then the older woman said, yeah, the Confederacy, they would never have supported what he did. And I said, well, what do you make of the fact that white supremacist organizations around the world, you fly the Confederate flag as a symbol? And she said, oh, they're just on the internet. They don't understand what this is. They just saw something on the internet and they didn't know what it stood for. And then she passed on, she said, you know, in Charleston, we don't believe in these kinds of things, and we have a community here. And, you know, as you saw, like, when this happened, people did not riot. You know, they didn't let Black Lives Matter come in and destroy the city. And what was interesting to me is that as she was saying this, she said the big triumph was that Black Lives Matter had not destroyed the city. But as she was saying this, she was standing like directly next to, like as close as this stand is, directly next to a Confederate cannon. And I was like, it's like Charleston was destroyed once. It wasn't by Black Lives Matter. It was by the Union Army in the course of a war that was being fought inextricable from the cause of ending slavery. And so we have like this denial. There's another element of this conversation that has to be understood about Charleston. And that is, like, in the very particular history of Charleston, that for most of the history of South Carolina, for most of South Carolina's history, if you count from the colonial period up until the 20th century, it was one of two locations in the United States, Mississippi being the other, where the Black population actually exceeded the size of the white population. And to this day, there's roughly half of Black people in the United States who can trace back at least one ancestor who came through the slave port in Charleston. It was by far the most prolific, most prosperous slave port in the United States. And so it has this tremendous history. Also because of Charleston, the kind of low-lying area, it is exceedingly hot. And it is also, at this point, a malarial plain. And for some epidemiological reasons I won't get into, West Africans fared much better in malarial plains because of the sickle cell trait in malarial plains than did Europeans. And so the short version of this meant that Black people could survive in South Carolina in ways that white people often could not. As a matter of fact, when we think about South Carolina, there's one agricultural product that we think in the context of it, which is Carolina, not cotton, rice. If you know anything about rice agriculture, rice is grown in kind of bog, swampy, wet areas, and which also grounds are very hospitable to breeding of mosquitoes which carry malaria. As a matter of fact, the species, the grain of rice that is most predominantly grown in South Carolina now traces its history back to Africa, back to West Africa. And so when South Carolina was created, it was a colony. which had an intention. Most of the colonies, the 13 colonies were all established for various reasons, for trading reasons, Maryland for religious freedom reasons, for lots of Catholics in Maryland, and Georgia as a penal colony and so on. South Carolina was established mainly to be an agricultural, literally feeder for another colony, which was Barbados. Barbados was a sugar-producing colony. They were so prosperous and had gained so much money. Sugar was so profitable to them that they did not even allocate enough arable land for growing crops that could feed themselves. Every available inch of soil that could grow sugar was used to grow sugar, and they simply imported all their food stocks from other colonies. And South Carolina grew rice in order to feed the enslaved population in Barbados. So all this is tied to the reasons that South Carolina has such a large black population. And culturally, this meant particular things. In 1739, there's a big slave rebellion, and there are slaves who are attempting to overthrow the regime and escape to freedom, which at that point would have been Florida, which is a Spanish possession, didn't return people to slavery in the American colonies. But the significantly large black population and the constant threat of slave revolt created a regime that was particularly adherent to the doctrines of control of the Negro. They could not have an iota of breathing room between themselves and the enforcement of the slave codes. And so South Carolina was very paranoid. And Mississippi later, when people talk about Mississippi in the context of the Civil Rights Movement, one of the reasons for this is that, and if you think about it, if you're a person who is holding people in bondage and you were in the majority, you can be kind of lax because, at the end of the day, what are they going to do? But if you're a person who is holding people in bondage and they outnumber you significantly, you have to be constantly vigilant. And so this has been kind of forgotten. It's a forgotten aspect of American history and the history of the South. As a matter of fact, I got into a conversation recently with a guy who was from the South Carolina Secessionist Party. And did somebody chuckle? You should. So this conversation is interesting because the guy was telling me that, the Confederacy, he thought the Confederacy was heroic and, his ancestors had fought for the Confederacy and so on, and that, you can't just make it seem like they were all fighting just for slavery. They were fighting to defend the state that they belonged to. And he said, most people in South Carolina didn't fight because they supported slavery. And I said, most people in South Carolina were black, so they didn't fight at all. And so you could see like a ticker tape going across his forehead where he was like, the black people were Southerners. The idea they had existed in the South, they'd been born in the South, they'd been raised in the South, but it never crossed his mind that they were Southerners. And so why am I talking about South Carolina, and why are we going down this road, and why are we kind of established, and why are we connected into this idea, and what does this have to do with what King was talking about, and this web of mutuality and so on? There's a kind of long, twisted path of American history, particularly as it pertains to race. And it becomes, if you've followed it long enough, its twists and turns become familiar, almost predictable. And so the history of the country is the best guide to understanding the present of the country. So when I talk about this, and whenever I say this, inherently there's always like a kind of skepticism. Like, of course, the guy who writes about race thinks that race is everywhere, thinks that race is super important. No, not really. I think this is empirical. So when we talk about the foundation of this country, and we talk about the Constitution, the document that you all study and have to be so familiar with in the profession of law, and we see that the American racial prerogatives are baked into it. The 3/5 compromise, which we'll come back to in a moment, that allows people to count 60% of the enslaved population for purposes of representation. When we're calculating how many people represent your area in the House of Representatives, this is a calculation where Southerners benefit. At 1860, where there are 4 million black people enslaved, that's 2.5 million more people counted in the census than would otherwise be counted. Now, this is a country that was established over a conflict around taxation without representation. Yet you're counting 2.5 million people who can't vote, who have no rights, who are afforded no rights. The protection of the transatlantic slave trade, that it can't be abolished until 1808, can't be abolished for 20 years. The fugitive slave clause, the electoral college. We find all these elements that are directly tied to race and the empowerment of a slaveholding class in the cornerstone document of the oldest constitutional the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. If we move beyond that and looked at the history of this country and its makeup, the way that the United States became the United States, we find this again and again and again. Let's set aside for a moment, literally because it would take up the rest of the lecture, the economic dependency of the 13 colonies on slavery and the institution of slavery. But let's talk about what happens after that with the actual geography of the United States. When in grade school or junior high school, we were taught about the Louisiana Purchase and about Thomas Jefferson's great negotiating ability and how he, for the fire sale price of only $15 million, purchases land that doubles the size of the United States, and about the 13 states that in total or in some portion are product of the Louisiana Purchase. And this is all attributed to Jefferson's insight, his capacity as a statesman. We skip over the part about the Haitian Revolution. We skip over the fact that an uprising led by Toussaint Louverture, an enslaved man in Haiti, which had been the gemstone of the French colonial possessions, that Haiti alone had accounted for 2/3 of France's sales, of their trade. One colony, the end of the 18th century, one colony accounted for 2/3 of France's trade. And that trade was overwhelmingly sugar. And that sugar was overwhelmingly grown in Haiti. If we want to have an idea of just how valuable Haiti was to France, think about how often, not even a number in days, how many hours do we go in any random day without sugar? A couple, if we're lucky. And so the emergence of sugar as a crop where you could grow it and actually make money, and the first time people get access to sugar regularly, it's amazing. And so this is the crown of the French colonial possessions. And it declares its independence as a result of a slave revolt. And it's Napoleon's disgust, as well as his financial losses, that are on his mind as Jefferson arrives in Paris with Sally Hemings to negotiate the settlement of this property, the purchase of this property. And so in a very real sense, all these states that we're talking about are connected to a slave revolt in Haiti. It's how the United States gets there. Also, when some months back, when the president referred to Haiti as a, quote, shithole country, I was like, without Haiti, you wouldn't have the country you have here. But a while back, let's say, I did a talk about Martin Luther King in Maine, on Martin Luther King Day in Maine. And as I was talking to people, I was like, yeah, your state only exists because of white supremacy too. And people in Maine were like, wait, what? I was like, you remember that compromise, 1820, where Missouri wanted to enter the Union And they were worried that there were 11 slave states and 11 free states, that a 12th slave state would tip the balance in the House of Representatives and the Senate toward the political power of slaveholding states, and that Henry Clay just basically negotiated carving out a new state in New England to counterbalance the authority of Missouri and the House and the Senate. Remember that? People were kind of like, oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. And so I left Florida and flew down to, I left Maine and flew to Florida. And I gave a talk there, and I told the people in Florida what I told the people in Maine. And they were like, and I was like, well, before you get too smug. You remember that situation in 1819 where the upstart general, Andrew Jackson, marched into what was then a Spanish possession and seized it? And he did so without the authorization of President Monroe, but he did it at the behest of slaveholders in South Carolina and Georgia. Because if you remember, I said if you were a person who was trying to flee slavery in South Carolina, you fled south into Florida prior to 1819, because Spain would not return you. And Andrew Jackson seized this Spanish possession in order to cut off one avenue of escape from slavery and the financial losses that were being incurred by the slaveholders. And so Florida, and then a kind of rearguard action, the Monroe administration hastily negotiates a deal to purchase Florida from Spain to actually save both countries embarrassment. But that's how we get Florida, for better or worse. Any Floridians here? Oh, sorry about that. But just as an aside, I won't give you an aside. Texas, when people say, remember the Alamo, you don't remember everything about the Alamo. One of the things that we don't talk about is the fact that one of the chief sticking points that resulted in the Texan secession was the fact that Mexico gave away land in what was then the northeastern portion of Mexico to American farmers, because they saw how much money the American government was making from cotton. And they said, here's the deal, we will give you land. What we want you to do is bring your agricultural expertise, come to our territories, grow cotton, we will generate revenue from the taxes on that cotton, and everyone will be fine. We have two prerequisites. One is that you cannot do this with slave labor, and the other is that you have to convert to Catholicism, both of which the American colonists ignored, landholders ignored. And so when we talk about Texas seceding and the way that Texas comes to exist as a state, ultimately incorporated into the United States, again, that history of slavery pops up, that history of race pops up. We could just kind of go through states. I won't. California enters in 1850 in order to create a fugitive slave agency, literally. California gets to enter the Union in exchange for a government bureaucracy that was charged with tracking down people who had found their way to freedom. And so the physical geography of this country reflects these prerequisites. And so in this context, when people say we the people, they have a wildly disparate understanding of what that term means. And so even if we move forward in history and we're talking about the Dred Scott decision, when Roger Taney writes that, he says that a Negro has no rights that a white man is bound to respect, like the kind of typical condemnation of that phrase comes from the fact that we think that Taney is announcing his own opinion. He's not. He's announcing what he believes to be the opinion of the founders of this country, saying, based upon everything that I understand about the founders, they never intended the Negro to be part of this compact that we have. And he says that makes this argument with some justification. As a matter of fact, if I go back to South Carolina for a minute, one of the notable things that happened after the shooting was that they removed the Confederate flag. And I talked with a man by the name of Malcolm Graham. His sister was a woman by the name of Cynthia Graham Hurd, who was one of the victims in the church. And he said that he was not impressed by the removal of the Confederate flag because that presumed that flag held an equivalent value to my sister's life. And he said that this is in no way a kind of equal transaction, her life for this flag. But the flag is removed, people make a kind of big point about it, and we don't talk about what else is there, what else remains on the grounds there. It's a monument to Strom Thurmond, the segregationist senator who ran for president in 1948 on a platform. The platform had 3 planks. First plank was segregation, second plank was segregation, third plank was even more segregation. Of course, this did not pertain to his personal matters because, as we know, Strom Thurmond fathered a child with a black woman domestic who was employed in his household. So he didn't believe in the personal element of segregation as it pertained to him. So that monument stays there. The monument to J. Marion Sims, the kind of father of modern gynecology who experimented on enslaved black women, that's still there on the grounds. The monument to Ben Tillman, the segregationist governor of South Carolina who bragged about having led lynching parties, having participated in the lynching of black people, that's still there. But the most troubling thing on the grounds of South Carolina state capitol were not those people whose villainous actions could be easily classified and categorized. The most troubling element on those grounds is a statue of George Washington. And the statue of Washington is there because the Confederates, in fighting against the Union Army, believed, they conceived of themselves as the true upholders and the true heirs to the founders, to the vision of 1776. That the North was attempting to reroute the path of American democracy, that this republic was supposed to be inclusive of all people. So when we say we the people, there's a definitional conflict about we, but there's also a definitional conflict about people, like who qualifies as a person. And that's implicit in this conflict and what's happening here. And so in 1857, when Taney is writing, he's writing about a very specific and particular narrative in American history. He's not just kind of plucking this out of thin air. And that people would say that when John Bingham writes the 14th Amendment, which specifically takes aim at that Dred Scott decision, that's the point at which people, and he does so in the wake of the Civil War. It's like, well, you win, so you get to make up the rules that we're playing by, but this whole birthright citizenship thing, that's not what we were originally talking about. That's not originally what and the whole thing about the Negroes being included and everyone born here, like this is a different conception of American democracy, that you are now creating something, a second generation of founding fathers, if you would. And so this is the argument that people present. And so it plays out in this variety of ways, over the ensuing course of American history in ways that have all these kinds of profound implications. And not simply, I've talked a lot about this idea of black people and as the kind of acid test of American democracy, but it's not simply exclusive to this. It's the kind of successive tribalistic vision of what this country is. It has a great deal of durability. And so Susan and I were just talking earlier, as a matter of fact, about a book that came out last year by a law professor by the name of James Whitman called Hitler's American Model. Some people may have seen it. If you haven't, it's a short book. You should take a look at it. And what he does is talk about the parts of American history that people find disturbing if you haven't been looking at the entirety of American history. It's shocking if you've only looked at the euphemistic version of the American past, like what we like to think about ourselves. And if you've looked at the entire span, then it's really not that shocking. And what he says is that Hitler, a lot of people know that in Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote that Europe failed to understand the importance of race purity. that they could not grasp what would happen if these countries could not grasp what would happen if they allowed their bloodlines to be poisoned and polluted. So, but there's one society in the world that gets it, and that society is the United States. It's that point where you're being complimented by people who you really don't want to be complimented by. You know, it's like Clarence Thomas saying, in my estimation, this is a person who's completely free of any idea of sexism. You're going like, I don't think, you know, Harvey Weinstein thinks I'm a great person. No, you don't really want that. That's not the arbiter that you want, you know? But Adolf Hitler is saying that American society understands it. And he's saying it with some basis. As a matter of fact, he goes on further to look at the ways in which the Nuremberg laws, essentially disfranchising Jews in Germany, were modeled on American segregation laws. And it's actually this kind of curious observation that one of these lawyers that Hitler has dispatched to the United States to understand how you more efficiently disfranchise a population that you find to be problematic, says, you know, I think there's a lot that we can learn from the Americans, except that some of this stuff is just frankly too harsh. They actually say this, right, in the language. Like, these people are nuts, you know, when it comes like to this racial stuff. And then he said there's other problems that, you know, the Jews look like us, so we can't, it's like the Americans have an advantage, like they know who the Negroes are. And so, like, all these things that people are kind of going back and forth on. But this is not a one-sided admiration. There's a great deal of, or a very fairly significant lineage, genealogy of support for these kinds of movements in the United States. So last summer, when we saw the fiasco in Charlottesville, and we saw these neo-fascist movements, not coincidentally, bound together between the Nazi flag and the Confederate flag. We saw people marching with both of them, and we saw people under the banner of these neo-fascist movements, and people saying, we've never seen this before. I was like, no, we haven't, except for the last time that we saw it, and the time before that, and the time before that. Because when Martin Luther King began marching in the North, in the Chicago campaign in 1966, 1967, one of their biggest, kind of most visible antagonists came from Lincoln Rockwell and the American Nazi Party. And so this is in an American city, 20 years or so, after the end of World War II, that people are actually countenancing. They're the Negroes marching here saying they want equality and the things that are supposedly upheld in the Constitution. They're the Nazis marching here saying we want to kill everyone that doesn't look like us. Who do we side with? That's a tough one. It's an actual moral conundrum. In 1967, if we went back to World War II with the German-American Bund and Fritz Kuhn, the biggest supporter of Nazism, most high-profile supporter of Nazism in the United States, and the fact that he had 20,000 people come out to support his cause in Madison Square Garden, no less, that there is this lineage of these ideas here. And just kind of momentarily, and it's kind of driven by this paranoia that is not unrelated to the paranoia that drove slaveholders in South Carolina. Oh my God, we're about to be outnumbered. And this question of demography, and who is here, and how many of them are here, and why are they coming here? And so, interestingly enough, when people were marching in Charlottesville, they were chanting alternately, Jews will not replace us, and you will not replace us, meaning as everybody who's not one of us. And I remember in kind of my arch sense of humor, when you're going like, who wants to replace you? Nobody's really like thinking about you. It's like I'd spend a lot of time in activist communities. I'd talk with people, and, I wrote one of the first like in-depth examinations of the roots and origins of Black Lives Matter. And not once has anyone ever come up to me and been like, hey, guess what? We're about to replace the white people. I'm like, word? It's like 61% of the population. How do you plan on doing that? You know? But nobody's actually saying this. But there is this kind of paranoia around the idea of there being equal numbers in democracy. And that's what ties in American politics contemporarily. That's what ties this issue of immigration to the issue of voter suppression. There are more people coming, and those people will vote. There's a problem with the Voting Rights Act, which allowed a certain pariah population to vote. And now there are all these other people coming from these places that we don't understand, that we can't pronounce, and they're going to be able to vote too, as soon as they get citizenship. And so it becomes this kind of demographic gambit tied to this theme in American history. So I would say to my students, I would say, like, in American history, we have this situation, well, let's say we have contemporarily a situation, and we'll say there's an ethnic group that is accused of smuggling drugs into the United States and also undercutting white American workers, stealing jobs, and there are too many of them in California. They say, oh, we're talking about Mexicans. No, we're talking about the Chinese in 1882, which is how we got the Chinese Exclusion Act. Or I'd say, okay, I'm going to talk to you about a religious group that is believed to be aligned with American enemies, that they are people among their ranks who are plotting the demise of the American system as we know it, but they will not inform on who they are, and they are coming from abroad, and they need to be under surveillance, and if at all possible, we need to expel them. And it say we're talking about Muslims. I said, no, we're talking about Jews in 1919 and 1920. And so we find this commonality again and again and again tied to demographics. There's another point that I want to make before I start to kind of like tie some of these things together, which is that Susan and I learned that we have something in common, which is that we are both from Queens. And so I'm a Queens native, was born there, Mary Immaculate Hospital. My christening, my father and the priest were late because they were at a Mets game. They were listening to a Mets game, literally. This was 1969. The Mets were in the World Series. Like, anybody who's a baseball person knows this. Like, this franchise that sucked for all of its history, then all of a sudden went to the World Series, and they were like, well, my son can be formally introduced to his life of Catholicism at any time, but this seventh inning, who knows how that's going to turn out? And it's like his father with the priest. So this is me. I'm a Queens person. I went to Jamaica High School. And one of the notable things about Jamaica High School was that when I was there was that I played baseball and I was a right fielder, and our center fielder was Puerto Rican, our shortstop was Colombian, first baseman was Jamaican, left fielder was Sikh, Indian. Two of our pitchers were Jews. So I would say we took the field looking like the United Nations. And we sucked, we couldn't play for anything, but that's kind of what we looked like. We were a reflection of the school, which was in turn a reflection of that community. And, the President of the United States is also from Queens. Generationally, he has a different relationship to Queens, because in my youth, in my childhood, Queens was what it is now, statistically the most diverse county in the United States. So at least 400 languages are spoken in Queens, with some people estimating as many as 800 languages being spoken there. Trump, his generation of Queens residents, grew up in a place that was overwhelmingly white. It was the second whitest borough of New York. And so white, in fact, that when Jackie Robinson purchased a home, this is Jackie Robinson, when Jackie Robinson purchased a home in Queens, a cross was burned near his property to let him know he wasn't welcome. And LaGuardia Airport was segregated. People don't know this. They don't know this history of the city. And so in 1965, the United States changed its immigration laws from the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, which had the explicit purpose of bringing in fewer of the people that people were worried about, really targeting Jews, but also Italians and Irish and all the people who had come in significant numbers at the end of the 19th century. And so the National Origins Act literally was looking at where you were from and determining how many of you were allowed to come to the United States. It was overwhelmingly racist. 1965 Immigration Act changes that, the Hart-Sellers Act, and liberalizes immigration law. And the face, literally the face of American society has been changed as a result of that. This is when we began to see significant numbers of people immigrating from Latin America, from the Caribbean, from East Asia, from South Asia, from Africa, from every place that we see people coming in. And one of the first destination places was, one of the first kind of landing pads was Queens. And this is partly because both of New York's airports are in Queens, and people began to settle there. And the composition of the borough changed dramatically. And so some people who were old enough, or maybe if you're just kind of a pop culture fan, you'll remember a TV show called All in the Family, which came in the 1970s, was a character by the name of Archie Bunker. And he played the kind of lovable bigot figure. He was this working class guy, but he was really bewildered by the forces surrounding him. And he was racist in ways that he thought were just kind of commonsensical. And he had no kind of understanding of the ways in which the world was changing around him. And not coincidentally, that show was set in Queens. Like, they're talking about these dynamics that took place in Queens. And so this language of nativism, this language of fear, this language of tribalism, that individual sense of we, that rebellion, that resistance against what Dr. King is talking about, this network of mutuality, that is something that the current president was very familiar with decades before those became major concerns in the rest of the country. And so in 2016, people were adapting a language that Donald Trump had learned to speak fluently as a young person. And that is the language of ethnic resentment and recrimination, anxiety, so on. So all these things are kind of tied together, bound together. What Dr. King was talking about, and one of the things that I think we have not done enough, is paying attention to King, not specifically as a theologian, but King as a person, as a reader of American history. And when you go through his speeches and his writings, he talks again and again and again about American history. He cites historians in his speeches. In a speech that he gave in 1965, how many of you have seen Ava DuVernay's film Selma? Okay, so you know that speech that, oh my God, the actor who played Dr. King. Y'all just gonna leave me hanging? Excuse me? David Oyelowo, yeah, right, exactly. That he gives at the end. If you ever read that speech that Dr. King gave in 1965, that speech, and he's talking about what they have encountered in the route to getting voting rights, that speech is almost entirely a diagnosis of American history. And when he talks about this language of being bound together, he's putting himself in opposition to this tradition, what I just spent the last 45 minutes elucidating. And the reason that he can do this is that he points to a counter tradition. He points to a tradition of people who actually believe that there is a possibility of there being multi-ethnic democracy in American society. That there is a narrative that connects it. One of the things that is most deliciously ironic in American history, as a matter of fact, is that now when people talk about, states' rights, if someone talks about states' rights, we almost exclusively identify this with the cause of the Confederacy. People say the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery, it was fought over states' rights, which is kind of a dodge. It was fought over states' rights to have slavery. But that's neither here nor there. When we actually get into this, King talks about this in that same letter to Birmingham jail and in the I Have a Dream speech. He talks about the ideas of interposition and nullification, and they have been used as kind of constitutional doctrines to typically to defend the cause of slavery, or at least the prerogatives of white supremacy. But there's a kind of perfectly ironic history. Like when we go back, we find those ideas connected to John C. Calhoun, this figure of titanic Confederate importance, who has a massive, massive monument to him in South Carolina, in Charleston, actually about a block, less than a block from where the church stands, where the shooting took place. But no, Calhoun was actually inspired to adopt those ideas of states' rights from his predecessor, Thomas Jefferson. In 1796, in response to the Alien Act, Jefferson, along with James Madison, conjures this idea that is immediately seen as kind of dangerous and possibly going to divide the country, the newly established country. But he establishes this idea that states could nullify laws, federal laws, that went against their own local interests, their own local laws. And he comes up with this idea in response to the Alien Act. The Alien Act changed, recognizing that very many immigrants were voting for Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. His political opponents conjured up this law that would change the amount of time that took to become a citizen from 5 years to 13 years. And so this is directly targeting people who are likely to vote for Thomas Jefferson or Jefferson's party. And when they come up with this idea, this nullification and interposition, it's to assist people who have been targeted by these laws. So you all see what I'm saying? States' rights, the idea of states' rights, originated as a ploy to protect vulnerable immigrants. So we find ourselves in 2018, we don't understand this. We see these kind of connections, we see this idea, we don't see the connections between these questions that are at the beginning of the country and these questions that are here now. And so I'll wrap up with one thing, because I want to make sure I want to get time for our questions. One of the things that King did, I would also encourage you to see, if you haven't seen it, a documentary called King in the Wilderness. It's about the last 18 months of Dr. King's life, when he was terribly unpopular, when he was being criticized by white supremacists, being criticized by younger activists who thought he wasn't radical enough, being criticized, having fallen out of the favor of the Johnson administration for his criticism of Vietnam. And it's really kind of King trying to find where he fits in a very rapidly shifting landscape. And one of the things we don't know is he was under such stress that he developed a tic. We think of him as this incredible, flawless speaker and his gift for oratory, but he actually developed a stutter at one point because of his the amount of stress that he was under. And this is an incredible moment where Harry Belafonte talks to him about it and says that eventually the stutter disappeared. And he asks him, and Harry Belafonte and King were like very, very close friends. And so Belafonte asks him, what happened, why'd the stutter go away? And he says, Martin said to me, it was easy, I got rid of it. He said, how'd you get rid of it? He said, I made my peace with death. And so it's like King at that moment, the person who's full of self-doubt, who wonders if he's accomplished anything, if he'll get anything else that he'll be able to accomplish, and also knows that he's running against a clock, and the clock is how much longer will he be alive. I think that's the King that we need to be more familiar with. And the reasons why is something that goes back to what he says in that Birmingham speech, right after he talks about the inescapable network of mutuality. It's where he says that change does not come in on the wheels of inevitability. And that famous quote of his is associated, he says that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And if you read the rest of what King says, he's really saying, oh, I'm sorry, you have to get out and bend it toward justice. And that's the actual work. And that's what the responsibility of engagement as a human being, as a citizen, as an adult, as a journalist, as a lawyer, as future lawyers, as students, that is a democratic responsibility that Dr. King left to us. And so when he gave that Nobel Prize speech in Oslo, and he said, one of the things he did was explain why they used the phrase, we shall overcome. And he said that they weren't simply saying it to their opponents, they were also saying it to themselves. It's kind of a mantra to boost their confidence, to tell themselves they would win. And he said that the phrase gave their weary feet renewed energy as they marched on toward the city of freedom. And when our days grow dreary with low hovering clouds, and our nights grow darker than 10,000 midnights, we will nonetheless know that we are witnessing the creative tension of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. And that is the most eloquent description of what it is that King has left to us, the responsibility to create a genuine civilization. It didn't happen in his time, but he maintained the idealism that it might happen in ours. Thank you. So, questions, criticisms, tell me where I'm wrong. Yeah,
Regarding memorialization, so Germany especially has a lot of monuments regarding World War II, and as an entire country that is considered perpetrators, do you think that one of the reasons there's not this inherent tension that exists in the United States is because they have, at a systemic level, not tried to justify what, say, the Holocaust stands for or what was done during World War II, where this wholesale justification or attempt to justify does exist in the United States?
Yeah, one, I think that's true. Did everybody hear the question? Yeah, so I think that's true, that Germany had to come to terms with what they did in World War II. But there are a couple of asterisks with it. One is that Germany had no choice. That was the requirement of readmission into the community of nations, so to speak. And that the West held what Germany did over its head. And so there was a kind of moral obligation that they had to. And they had to pay reparations to Israel and these things that they had to do in order to kind of make amends to be a modern, Western state. And so the other part of it is that what the Confederacy did, what the Americans did around the Confederacy, is more typical than atypical. That we've seen numerous instances where people have committed incredible atrocities and simply denied that they're happening. We see that now with the Rohingya Muslims. But if we're not even using a contemporary example, we see with the Turks in Armenia, where there's 1 million people who died as a result of the genocide, and Turks simply say it never happened. In World War II, the Soviet soldiers killed about 20,000 Poles and buried them in mass graves in the Katyn forest, and then simply said it never happened. In Nanking in 1939, where the Japanese killed about 500,000 Chinese, and in such obscene numbers that the Japanese soldiers were complaining to their commanding officers that they were exhausted from all the killing. They'd be charged with waking up at dawn and literally killing all day until sunset. And so in the wake of that, Japan simply said it didn't happen. And so we have this idea of exceptionalism in the United States, as if we don't function by the same sorts of human fallibilities here that people do in other parts of the world. But when we look at what happened with the Confederacy, and W.B. Du Bois is like perfect on this in Black Reconstruction. He says we've never talked truthfully about the history of the Civil War because the North was embarrassed that it had to depend upon 200,000 Black men to save their republic. And the South was embarrassed for the world to know that they had fought to their last man for the right to buy, sell, whip, rape, own, trade, traffic, and exploit Black people, human beings. And so there's a kind of gentleman's agreement among them to never actually talk about what had been going on. And that is at least as common in world history as it is uncommon.
First, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Found it very insightful. I guess my question goes towards more in the present, like based on the history and everything that's happened, how do we move forward? How do we kind of bridge sort of these gaps that exist? And I guess what sort of solutions do you have, especially us as law students that are going to be out in the real world kind of making that impact? What can we do to improve it and not kind of step backwards?
Well, I mean, I think that on the issue of what you can do as law students, I mean, there's no shortage of ways in which you are. Who would have thought, I think, 2 years ago, when we're looking at the kind of authoritarian, I have a 17-month-old, and so I'm in a constant state of sleep deprivation. And so whenever I stumble over my tongue, I just blame her. And so, but when we're looking at the authoritarianism that we've seen in this country, that one of the chief bulwarks against anti-democratic actions has been the judiciary. It's been people filing lawsuits. And I think that when the first travel ban came down, one, I don't think that the Trump administration even knew that there was such a thing as judicial review. They were kind of like, what are you talking about? We said we're doing this, and now this judge is saying this. And he was like, what is this? It was like a democracy, something approaching a democracy, something clinging by its fingernails to the concept of being a democracy. And so I think that that's that. But in the work that I do, it's been, as a young graduate student in history, I had a part-time job working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And that's where I learned really the kind of dynamic connections between the things that I was learning and the things that were happening in the real world. So I could tell you the history of the 14th Amendment and John Bingham and all these things that happened and so on and so forth in the context of the black codes. But it's not until I'm actually seeing the lawyers who are fighting these cases where I'm going like, oh, and even then going back to King, where King talks about the 14th Amendment, in his rhetoric, like there's a very interesting kind of, I guess, meta-analysis of the ways that these things are interconnected. I think probably your law professors are much more adept at telling you the specifics of that, but I think there's no shortage of ways. And then you had a question at the beginning, which escapes me. What was the first question?
Just like, how do we bridge the gap based on the history? I mean, you mentioned the travel ban. There was the case years ago, the Korematsu case, which is kind
right,
of
which is still in the books.
Exactly.
So
how do you?
interestingly enough, I was in California in July, and I've always wanted to drive from kind of north to south in California, and so I just did it. I had some friends, I stopped in various places, And then on the way through, I'm in the middle of the desert. It's really beautiful. And I see this place, Manzanar. And I was like, oh, wow, this is the internment camp. And so I pull off and drive, and it is in the middle of nowhere. Like when they sent people there was like, the idea of there being like kind of mass resistance is like, sure, and then what? Because there's literally nothing out there. And the kind of most damning thing is that, you're hemmed in by a mountain on one side, then just desert. And the federal government believes that it's still nothing wrong, nothing unconstitutional with having sent these people here simply on the basis of their ethnicity. And that's a kind of frightening idea. But I believe in the kind of long perspective. One, because I'm a historian, and two, because I'm my father's son. And everywhere I go, somehow or another, I wind up mentioning the fact that my father had a third grade education, and I have a PhD. That's not supposed to happen. That is not supposed to happen. The reason that that's possible is that there were a bunch of people who refused to believe that what they were told were the parameters of democracy in the society were the actual parameters of democracy in the society. And so there are those things, but I always want to not leave people on the basis of despair, to think that the problems that we're confronting are insurmountable. What they are is recalcitrant and enduring, but I don't think that means that they are kind of unable to ever be defeated, infallible in those ways. So I hope that's something of an answer.
So I thought it was really interesting that Martin Luther King, he said the promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it interesting that it almost alludes the fact that democracy, as we have seen, or as he has seen, is not actually the democracy that that we were told to believe in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I think after that he started looking into a little bit of democratic socialism, and we're seeing kind of that rhetoric now in our political climate of when you're talking about two parties, and let's say Bernie being really popular with the youth, and he's very democratic socialist. How do you see that sort of playing out in how now as a society we're defining democracy as? Because one seems almost like very nationalistic, that's tied to capitalism, and the other one is much more inclusive, but it has a different economic concept that's not capitalist.
Okay, so meet me here every Monday for the rest of the semester, and we'll just put it on the books, because that's a course, that's a class. But what I will say in a succinct way is that this narrative around populism in the United States, first off, there were things that we were seeing that were egregiously racist that were happening. And I know I say that as somebody who went to some of those rallies, and egregiously misogynistic. And people were just kind of, in a kind of national habit to speak in euphemisms, they were saying, it's populism. Although if we knew anything about the history of populism, we would know that those two things tend to be very closely related, that the kind of overt racism and conspiracy theorizing, paranoia, those are all very prominent elements of kind of the American tradition of populism. But there's a kind of narrative, it's like two siblings that bear a very significant familial resemblance, but have very different personalities. So there's another narrative of populism that has been inclusive. That's the narrative of populism that King was actually addressing, that you're actually talking to, which is not explicitly, not simply democratic socialist, but of which the democratic socialist narrative would be part of it, would be one element of it. One of the things I think that's interesting is that we've seen this before, that in 2016, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were running as various incarnations of those two strands of populism in American society. In 1948, you would have seen the same thing. George Wallace was running as a populist candidate on a platform that would be strikingly similar to what you would think of listening to Bernie Sanders now, and explicitly anti-racist and calling to the common people to be, united. And on the opposite side of it, Strom Thurmond was running as a kind of Southern populist, saying, like, you have to keep the Negroes down if you didn't call us Negroes. And the theme of populism, the kind of populism that we're much more familiar with, that goes from, I'm sorry, did I say George Wallace? I meant to say Henry Wallace, forgive me. Henry Wallace in 1948. And then the narrative of George Wallace in 1968, also the same sort of populist, and the Strom Thurmond tradition. On the right wing of it, there's the George Wallace populism, the Strom Thurmond populism, and it literally goes back to the inception point of populism in American history, where you have a movement that is simultaneously anti-racist and racist. And if you go back to looking at people like, even Ben Tillman, who I just mentioned, who's a kind of egregious racist populist, but Tom Watson, the biggest figure associated with populism, prided himself on having stopped a lynching and is also responsible for starting a lynching. At different points in his career, he did both of those things. And in both times, he would have said he was doing this to protect the common man. And so there's that narrative that connects both of those things. To your more specific point, I think that there's something to people beginning to look at these things. The housing crisis, was part of that narrative. The staggering income inequality, which is a term that I hate. I always say income inequality sucks because it has no verbs. It's like income inequality is just something that happens. If you have a particular set of climatological circumstances, snow will fall. It's like, oh, wow, these things have happened. Now we have income inequality. Whereas back in the day, people would refer to it as class exploitation, which actually was telling you something. Someone was doing something to someone else. And so I think that those are all parts of this narrative. And the last thing I'll say, my criticism of a good bit of what's happening under the kind of banner of the kind of democratic socialist left, is that historically and sometimes contemporarily, these are people who are seeking not to address all the means by which people are exploited, but seeking to use class as a way of avoiding talking about race. But when we look at that, even the article that came out in the Times yesterday about life expectancy, and literally the most fundamental part, all the stuff that we're talking about, housing, education, income, healthcare, we can't do any of those things if we're not alive. But literally the most fundamental aspect of our relationship to the society, which is how many breaths we get to draw, is tied to, they found 4 factors when they looked at these places in the lowest life expectancy percentiles. 1 was that they were low income. 2 was that they were low education. 3 was that they were in the South. And 4th was that they were overwhelmingly Black. And that last one counts no less than that first one does. And until I think democratic socialists are comfortable, especially white democratic socialists, are comfortable with admitting that race actually is a thing. It's not a biological thing, but it's a social thing that has actual social consequences, that movement is going to be seriously hampered when you see things like Bernie Sanders not being able to get any support in the South.
It seems to me, in hearing all your discussion as a historian, as a newspaper journalist,
A magazine journalist, but yeah.
to have, move forward with any kind of truth or reparations or reconciliation, it seems to me that there has to be an understanding in the education piece, right? And an acknowledgement of this is what's happened. And if we don't do something, it's gonna occur again. What do you say to this, I guess the sense that I get from listening to the news and seeing, the general population and speaking to people, that they're not believing evidence. And our whole, we're based on evidence, right? So climate change, racial healing, anything
Right.
like that is based around this evidence, and whether we have the evidence or not, if people aren't listening to it, how are we ever gonna move forward?
I don't know the answer to that. If I did, I swear I'd be on the highest mountaintop shouting it. But it is like this real problem where, as a friend of mine made this distinction that people operate on their emotional reality as opposed to the empirical reality. And so among Trump supporters, a very high percentage of them believe that white people are the most exploited group of people in American society. I'm not joking. And sometimes, first of all, I shouldn't say these are simply Trump supporters. If you do a generic poll of white people's attitudes about race, you often find either large pluralities or sometimes majorities who will tell you that white people have it the worst in American society. There's no indicator that says that. There is no index, there's no study, there's nothing that comes up with that. But that is what people have run with. That there are men who will tell you that women have taken over. And that is, again, that doesn't, and then weirdly enough, what happens is that if you suffer an injustice, people use your attempts to rectify that injustice as evidence that you have too much power in the first place, which is what's happened with Me Too. It's what happened with the Civil Rights Movement. It's we've harassed her and, sexually assaulted her, but she was able to get him sent to jail. Doesn't that disturb you? Right, but I think that happens. It's like the kind of non-empirical approach to the world. And it also is somebody who works in media. People just decide to not believe the thing that makes them uncomfortable. It's not new. But it is more pronounced. But I will say this, one thing that I think is part of this, and as my colleague at Columbia in the journalism school pointed this out, is that what's happened in news media has been the collapse of outlets of local reporting, overwhelmingly. People tended to distrust the media, but they trusted their local newspaper. Because those people live with you. You might know the editor's kid might go to school with your kid or whatever, but people had a different kind of relationship to local media than they do to national media. And so the consolidation of media into these gigantic conglomerates have made it easier to distrust the entire entity in a way that the Americans distrust so many institutions. So it's not just media. People are able to have this kind of, as I would say, this a la carte approach to reality that, you just believe the things that you want to believe. And it's partly because there's nobody who has the authority to challenge that. People don't trust the educational system. They don't trust Congress. They don't trust the presidency. They don't trust corporations. When we do public opinion polls, the two institutions that people tend to trust, actually three, and the third one has an asterisk associated with it, which is that people trust small business, they trust the military, and they trust the police. And to the extent that you're talking about people of color, you can cut that trust in police in half. And so I say it to say that this is a symptom of a much bigger kind of phenomenon. Okay.
Oh, I just had a question. I think, so growing up, I grew up in a very homogeneous town where no one really looked like me. It was a very white Christian town. And when I went to college, I went to a Big Ten school and I was excited to see this diversity take place and everyone together. But what I realized is that sense of tribalism that you were kind of talking about, where people separate themselves based by race just automatically on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of contributes to this idea of separation, but do you think that this is causing more harm, or do you think that it's a survival skill that people use because of the separations that have already taken place in the past?
So I went to a historically black university, and my answer to that was always that we had to be both and so we were across town from Catholic University. And, nobody was telling the Catholics that they were too clannish. Why aren't you out socializing with the Protestants, and so, and then Gallaudet was across town from Catholic. And so there were these institutions that met particular needs of students. And I always saw an affinity with the Gallaudet students in particular because they were learning to operate in a hearing world. And in order to do that, it was beneficial for them to be around other people who had hearing difficulties around hearing. And so it wasn't an either or. And so I don't think that it has to be like, we're all tribalistic if we have any sense of community identity or people who are connected with us around bonds of ethnicity or religion or region or, any of the things that tie us together. Like, I think it's fine for me to grow up in New York and hate Boston. And I also think it's logical, reasonable. But I don't think that, I think it becomes when like the kind of boundaries turn into walls, pun intended, that we encounter like the problems. And so I'm somebody who spent the better part of my life, which is weird to think at this point to me, but spent the better part of my life studying the history of Black people in this country and really kind of globally. In no way does that like have an aspersion toward any other form of history, but it's just kind of my avenue into the kind of the relationship to the human experience and dimensions of humanity. It's unfortunate that what we see very often has become that. It's become like this kind of tribalistic sense, and like, we're opposed to them. And as I was saying earlier, I think one of the things that surprised me, and then I was like criticizing myself for being surprised, was I did not think that the United States would elect a political candidate who made fun of a person with a disability. I just didn't think that would happen. And then I was kind of like, why was I so naive? But it was the sense of us, he's one of us, that allowed people to overlook. And people typically will do, here's one other thing I'll say about this. One of the commonalities, almost every atrocity that we see that's been committed in the 20th century and moving forward, and even before the 20th century, when you look at the people who committed that atrocity, they said that they did it in the name of self-defense. Almost always. And it's their sense of who they are collectively and what imperils them, that kind of weaponizes that sense of identity. And so that's the thing that I'm pushing back against. This is like us versus them, not the idea that we have like particular things in common that we might want to get together and experience or interact around. Was that your question? Okay. You had a question then.
Yeah. A couple of the questions raise an issue I'm going to rephrase, and that is, what is the vehicle for mutuality as against this long history of racism in our country, really a mainstream racism. So the vehicle, I'm concerned, and I've heard from some of the questions, how do we go forward so as to promote mutuality, especially among the races? And one of the things that I think of is Martin Luther King's participation and leadership of the garbage workers strike, which was both white and Black workers. And that led me then to think, well, wait a minute. If actually we do focus on class, as some of the Democratic Socialist candidates might, doesn't that, and I think this has to be done with more awareness, but doesn't that set in motion dynamics for Black and white and other races to be working together towards better living conditions, better
Sure, in some ways, and in some ways not. And so that's some of the benefits of this. As a matter of fact, we've seen the reason that we had a great society, with all of its kind of shortcomings, was the fact that Lyndon B. Johnson was trying to address the fact that the big attempts to ameliorate issues around class in this country, the New Deal, was largely exclusive of Black people. So we've been able to address class in ways, like, as a matter of fact, the manufacture of the American middle class excluded Black people. And so, if we're talking about the GI Bill, suburbanization, federal subsidizing of homes, all these things that we have that have gone into creating what we now know of as the American middle class, and almost all those have some aspect of exclusivity as it related to people of color. By the same token, there are some things, and Reverend Barber is one of the people who's kind of doing work around this, and I have conversations with him. There are some areas of large overlap, in which these things can be useful. Like, one of the best examples of this, I think, is like Orange is the New Black, where Piper Kerman was like, oh, wow, look, this is like crazy. Look at this system. And she has this vantage point as this privileged middle or upper middle class white woman who finds herself in this institution that is warehousing millions of people of color, or hundreds of thousands of people of color at any given point in time. And then because she is who she is, we're able to watch this show that is talking about these elements of it. So people were saying, okay, the mass incarceration has vacuumed up these communities of color. Yeah, that's bad. So what? And they're like, wait, we're incarcerating blonde white women? Hey, we need those. But it's like the people have this different idea of this, but ultimately, if you are reforming our criminal justice system, the impact affects Black people as well, people of color. If you're able to see Piper Kerman's humanity in a way that you can't see the humanity of other people, which I lament, but if you're able to use that as a kind of Trojan horse to get change that affects communities of color, in the same way that the Freedom Riders, people would recognize that Black people have been getting killed for exercising their rights in this country since there has been a country, but then when they realized that people were killing young white college students, it shocked the conscience in a way that the death of Black people did not. Sure, but that doesn't get us to where we need to go entirely. And one of the reasons for that is that Black poverty and white poverty are not the same. A white person who's poor, overwhelmingly, they are the poor white family in a generally economically viable neighborhood, community, whereas Black poverty tends to be concentrated. When we talk about kind of concentrated poverty or poverty that exists, a poor family that exists in the orbit of lots of other poor families, that is overwhelmingly likely to be a Black person. Even when we start talking about middle-class Black people, like middle-class Black people, with a Black family with a household income of $100,000 has a home with the value of a white family with the income of $60,000, and that is purely about race. And so we can't kind of switch one out. We have to be able to deal with like the nuances of the way that both of these things interact with each other. Were you about to say something? Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say something.
So I have some comments, and I think it might form a question at the end, but just everything of what I've been listening to. So first of all, wow, thank you. That was a lot of information, a lot of well-needed information.
Thank you.
So I was going to start to say, like, I grew up in the Pink Houses projects.
Yeah. I know what it is.
And, like, growing up for me, I did not know Black people were a minority. Like, everybody there was Black. So you see the concentration of, like, poor Black people, like, it is a concentration. I had no idea that Black people were a minority. Like, never crossed my mind. So when we get in school, we start learning about slavery, like late elementary, early middle school, and it enrages you. You think of white people, you're like, oh my God, I didn't know they were like that. And now, so I saw on the internet the other day, I'm not sure if you saw it or aware of it, but a mom saw a textbook that her daughter brought home, and it's revamping slavery, like reworking slavery, and it's Black people came over, they wanted to offer their services to the country. It's this crazy thing now, so I wanted to know your spiel on that.
So, I mean, this the one I haven't seen that particular one, but that comes up like every year, or every couple years, where they start referring to the traffic that resulted in Africans being brought to North America as the triangular trade. Like, really? What were they trading? Because it was like, no, they took the slave part out of it, you know? It's just the triangular trade. So it was like, oh yeah, they were bringing rice, and then there was trade like sugar and rum, and so I mean, it sounds like a pretty good idea. Until you realize that they're like human beings involved in this. And so, yeah, it is, it's unfortunate because, and here's why it's unfortunate. And I say this a lot, I've been saying this a lot in the last 2 years, that you do a double disservice by giving that censored version of American history to our children. And the reason for that is this. One, they have a diminished capacity to understand the past. And because they have a diminished capacity to understand the past, they have almost no capacity to understand the jeopardies of the present. So if you believe this is a society, as many people do, that has been fundamentally sound from the outset, you've never had like any real moral problems, and that tragedy has never really happened here, you believe that passively things will be okay in the present. And that kind of naive, that kind of optimism that people associate with Americans, the kind of sunny outlook, other people would refer to ignorance and naivete. Because you don't have a full grasp of tragedy in the past. You think that tragedy can't occur in the present. And so I spent a semester in Russia, and one of the things that was interesting, I taught at a Russian university for a semester, one of the things that was interesting to me was that everyone was like very like stone-faced. You go around, it's like this. You know, and someone said to me, it was like, you know, it's interesting, you smile so much. I was like, I smile a lot? And I was like, first off, like people always tell me in America that I look mean. And I was like, and then two, I'm a Negro American, and we smile on average about 30% less than our white counterparts. So I'm going to do a study of this, is going around looking at people's facial expressions. But one of the things that happened, a friend of mine said, he said, you know, we see anyone who smiles that much and we think that either they're an idiot or they're trying to steal from us. Like a person who's smiling like that is either disingenuous or a complete idiot. And that history is connected to what happened in Russia in the 20th century. You know, living in a society where there was Stalin, living through World War II, where 26 million Russians die. There were so many mass graves that when I was there was a group of students who went out and voluntarily were bringing dirt to this this kind of public space because the bones were beginning to emerge from the soil. It was like when it's like a metaphor, like history literally being barely beneath the surface. Like when people who understand the dimensions of tragedy, that tragedy is a possibility in the present, tend to have a more sober outlook about that tragedy has been a reality in the past, tend to have a more sober outlook about the present. And I'm not saying that Americans should not be optimistic or forward-looking or sunny or anything, but it should be a kind of informed optimism. Not the optimism you have as a 6-year-old, is the optimism you have as a 40-year-old, where you've seen like battles and difficulties, but still say it's possible for good things to happen in the world. It's just like with King, the difference between saying there's a moral arc of the universe and it bends towards justice, and saying there's a moral arc of the universe and I bet you we can bend it toward justice. Okay, I can't answer any questions from, okay, 1 and 2.
Thank you for this talk. This is a fabulous talk. So I'm interested to hear you sort of reflect on the concept of voting, considering this last election when there were a lot of colleagues and folks who were saying we should not participate in the voting process because we, for centuries, have been voting for the lesser of two evils, and we should just, at this particular moment, with this particular election, let's pull out and not vote. So I'm interested to hear you sort of reflect on that logic of voting and considering this country's past and our present and what it means for our future. How might we think about voting as a democratic or civic responsibility? And also, for folks who are saying don't vote, how do we reorient ourselves as we move forward to think about if we're gonna do something about the White House, this is like the moment to be doing it. And I haven't heard those people as vocal in this particular moment thinking forward. So
the short thing is that whenever people tell me voting doesn't make a difference, I say if it didn't make a difference, they wouldn't have tried so hard to keep us from doing it. And so that's the first part of it. The second part of it was that it was never supposed to be like the sum total of your relationship to the state was that you cast a vote every 4 years or every 2 years. That you're supposed to be actively involved in, the people whom you have given authority over your life. And the third thing is that, there were lots of criticisms to be made about Hillary Clinton, but it's only a kind of lazy nihilism that said that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were the same. And even if they were like, even if you had 10 things that you didn't like about Hillary Clinton, you want someone to owe you. You want someone to owe you, to be indebted to you. That if you have an election and nobody owes you anything, then they can just go. Like you don't really have any. And then the fourth thing that I say with people when all of those things don't work is like juries. Because anybody who says that will tell you that the criminal justice system is not fair. Well, you don't vote, you're not going to get called for a jury. And if you're not on that jury, there are going to be a bunch of people who you disagree with who are. And there may be somebody in your community who receives something that doesn't qualify as justice as a result of it. So if there's this young 14-year-old who's been shot by a police officer and then and it's unarmed, and then the police officer is acquitted, and you're going like, I don't know how that happened. Well, you didn't vote. You weren't in that room. And if that doesn't work, I just throw up my hands and walk away. But I think that part of that, and there's some scholars that actually have done work around voting and why voting turnout is typically low in the United States. And, we have our elections on a weekday and et cetera, and all these things that go into it. Especially when I was in Ferguson, there was a lot of information about that, like how you could wind up with a town that's mostly black and elected officials that are mostly white very easily, depending on when you have your elections. You have your elections in November when people are coming out to vote for something else, sure. You have your election on a weekday in the summer that people don't even know about, and an election is happening, and you get, the kind of results that you'd be inclined to you want if you were a person who benefits from a low voter turnout. So I think they're all these kind of complex things. If nothing else, I think the fact that we now have a president that overtly, or at least is confused about whether or not Nazis are bad, should be like an argument for saying like maybe vote next time.
My question is kind of simple, but just in your gut as a historian, or you can use whatever you want, how do you think this thing with Trump, how does it end, and what do we get from it into history? And I don't mean Trump mentally is dragged from the castle. I mean like what do we like Reagan gave us, not Reagan, but Nixon gave us Jimmy Carter, and we got a different country after that. What do you think happens?
No, I think
Trump, no matter how it goes down.
I think the problems in this country are profound, and they extend far beyond Donald Trump. That he's just a symptom of a much bigger kind of thing that you have now. So, like, here's an analogy that you'll appreciate. I know we can talk about, like when Ali, who was just this phenomenal boxer and just incredibly talented, like one, he's like this tall, lean figure, and then like he's a big fighter, but he's so quick. Like you never see like fighters who are that large and that quick, and that incredible sense of that kinesthetic idea of like where his body is at any given point in time, and all the things that he did that were so great, in boxing. And then Henry Cooper hit him early in his career with that left hook that knocked him down for the first time. And then Ali got up and finished him off. Like nobody ever knows who Henry Cooper is, except for like an asterisk, the dude that knocked Muhammad Ali down. But the problem was Joe Frazier knew who Henry Cooper was. And everything that Joe Frazier did to Muhammad Ali, he did with left hooks. Because after that, they were like, as great and powerful and talented as Muhammad Ali is in his ability, he can't get around a left hook. And when there was a more talented person who exploited that, that's when we saw the real consequences of it. And so I think Trump is that left hook. Like he represents that people know that there's a particular path and a particular fault lines that have always been there in American society, but they know how to weaponize them in particular ways. And so now there'll be more of the same. And that's not to discount. In the long run, Henry Cooper did no damage to Muhammad Ali. I'm not saying that Trump will do no damage to us. I think he already has in many ways. So I don't know how we emerge from this. I also have like different fears. I think that in 2020, if he loses an election, he'll say the results were fake, and there will be people who believe him. I think that if he's impeached, he'll say that this is there's no basis for it. No matter what, Bob Mueller could release a video of him speaking to Vladimir Putin in Russian and being handed a bag of rubles and saying, "Da, comrade." And that people will not believe that there's a thing, that this is anything other than persecution. And so I don't know any way that we move forward without there being like really big challenges in the future. I think I have one last question. Why not? All right, thank y'all.